You didn't work this hard, earn this title, and build this much experience just to feel bored. Welcome to The Boardroom, the podcast for senior leaders who are accomplished, capable, and quietly craving more. I'm Mark, your Chief Career Officer. And every week, we unpack real stories from leaders who have made bold moves. Plus, I'll give you practical strategies to help you take ownership of the next chapter in your career. If you're done drifting and you're ready to move forward with clarity and intention, you are in the right room. Oh. All right, everyone, we are live today with Kristin Myers, who I am very excited to introduce to you. She is the Chief Digital Officer and Head of Technology at Northwell Health, which is a $23 billion health system with 28 hospitals, more than 104,000 employees. And at Northwell, she leads digital transformation, integration, and advancing AI. She leads digital, she leads data, she leads emerging technologies. And the goal here is to drive innovation, improve care delivery, and support the organization's strategic objectives. So, Kristin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So I want to talk a little bit about the trajectory of your career so that people can really understand like how you got to where you are today. Because we can find you on LinkedIn. It's easy to see where you've worked, but I feel like the whole story is always so much more interesting. So talk to me about the progression in your career.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to share a little bit about my journey. As you probably can hear, I grew up in Australia, and I would say that it really starts from college. I went to Queensland University of Technology and I studied law and information technology. I was actually going to be a lawyer. And it's an unusual combination, but I have to say early on, just was really interested in how technology could be, applied in, meaningful ways. And, I have also a passion for healthcare and I would say making a difference in patients' lives. So when I graduated after 5 years, I decided to go into technology. And my first role was at Cerner Corporation in Sydney as a systems integration analyst, and ultimately, was promoted to an architect. And it gave me a strong foundation in healthcare technology, and also I think, gave me a perspective very early on around how systems can impact patient care and also from a vendor perspective. After that, I had an opportunity to move to New York from Sydney, and I
That's
was
a big change.
it was a massive change. And Capgemini Ernst and Young actually recruited me, and at the time, it was just such a big leap and a difficult decision to make. I thought that I would be in New York for 12 months and then I would go back to Australia and live my life there. But I spent a few years consulting with CGMY, and ultimately, I really decided that I wanted to be in the driver's seat and really own, a department and, some of the technology strategies. And to do that, you really need to be in the provider organization. You can't, it was too difficult to do that really as a consultant. And so that experience, ultimately led me to Mount Sinai Health System. And, I spent about 20 years there. Started off as a director, really, bringing in Epic into the organization and supported a lot of the clinical transformation there, and ultimately took on broader responsibilities over those years and, stepped into the role of, Chief Digital and Information Officer and Dean for Research and Education Technology. And, spent, about, 3 to 4 years in that role. I must say that, thinking back on, all of that, all of those experiences really led me to, my current role as Chief Digital Officer and Head of Technology at Northwell, which is definitely where I want to be. I've had such an amazing experience here in the last 2.5 years. But thinking about, the journey itself and how I got here, I think, what's important to understand is, networking both within your organization and, outside of your organization is really important. And, I think investing in your own growth as well. In all of those years, completed a Master's of Public Health at Columbia and, also was very much focused on cybersecurity and did a cybersecurity Chief Information Security Officer certification at Carnegie Mellon. And I think that those two, additional degrees gave me, a foundation for executive leadership. So, yeah, it's been an amazing journey, quite frankly.
Okay, so I have questions here because I don't see a ton of people who stick in one industry and pursue that and have an interest and then a passion and then build it into a career over such a long period of time. So that interest in healthcare and where healthcare and IT meet, how did that spark hit for you? Because I know some people in healthcare say, oh, I had a grandparent who had, health issues that got me interested, or when I was young, like, was there like a defining moment in your life where you said, oh, this is the thing that I'm interested in, I'm going to pursue?
Yeah, look, I think that, very early on in my, college journey, I also had a health event myself. And, I think that as a patient and receiving care and, really understanding, the lack of coordination that occurs and some of the burdens that are shifted to yourself or your family is really important. And at that point in time, going all the way back, there wasn't a lot of technology being implemented, especially around patient experience. And so, for me, when the opportunity arose to work at Cerner Corporation straight out of college, I felt that, having that passion around healthcare and, from a patient perspective, and then, being able to use technology in that way, seemed to me to, meld those worlds. And so I think that opportunity at Cerner Corporation was an amazing one very early on. And it really started, I think, my career trajectory.
That's a big deal. Well, then you talked about the networking piece, inside, outside your organization, and I post on this about, post on LinkedIn about this all the time and shout it from the rooftops, I feel like. But talk about those opportunities that popped up for you in life because you met people and engaged with folks. Like, was that the driving force between each of the changes in your career?
I think that it's really important that you're able to, speak internally in your organization about, your accomplishments. And, you can't necessarily expect that everyone is going to, be keeping track of exactly what you're doing. And, I think that, there's obviously a line between, being, confident and being able to, share this information without, you don't want to be seen as obnoxious either. And I think, being, the person that I am, I really want to make sure that, it's just important that people understand what you're trying to achieve in an organization. So, again, internally networking and, just being very intentional about, the people that you're meeting and spending time with, I think is incredibly important. And as you get, further on, in your career journey, I think it's really essential. When I think about, career, the hops that I made, early on, a great example would be that, when I was working at Cerner Corporation, one of the directors there, actually had moved to Capgemini Ernst& Young. And so as he left, I spoke to him about, some of the work that I had been doing and, made a very, it sounds like an offhand remark now, but, if anything ever comes up, please let me know. And, within about 3 to 6 months, that was key in my view to, getting recruited from Capgemini Ernst& Young in the United States. So again, I think that, ensuring that, you are networking both internally and externally is just incredibly important.
That's huge. Well, and it can only come when you have clarity about who you are, what you offer, and what you want in your career. And it sounds like you were pretty clear the entire time what you wanted to accomplish. Like, was the C-suite always in your mind as the ultimate goal?
Not necessarily, I have to say, from the very beginning. I was really just open to experiences and learning. I think that, a theme from that I would see throughout my career is continuous learning and, experiencing, I would say, the world. And, I'm an avid traveler and, I just love, experiencing new cultures. And, I think that, you've got to be open to continuous learning. And as you know, technology is just rapidly accelerating and has done so over the last 30 years. And so I think it's important that, having that continuous learning mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I feel like that type of mindset is something that I see really consistently in more senior level leaders and the folks who don't invest in their own development, whether it's, officially, formally professional development, or if it's just I'm reading articles, I'm learning new things. Folks who don't do that are the ones who strive for greater levels of leadership and never attain it. And it's the ones who say, I'm going to spend an hour of my evening listening to a webinar, reading an article, reading a book on leadership. It's those types of folks who are really specific about it, like you did, right? Earning additional degrees and certifications. Those are the kinds of things that keep us sharp and keep us thinking from new perspectives because we're always learning from new perspectives. Sounds like
Yes,
that was huge for you.
absolutely. I would 100% agree.
Pivots in your career. There's been some big changes, like the move from Australia to the US. Do you feel like there's been one like really intentional reset that you've made in your career?
Yeah, I think that one of the greatest resets that I've had professionally, was really the pivot that I made in the last 2.5 years from Mount Sinai to Northwell. I have to say that I wasn't necessarily looking to leave my position, and I'd grown up there professionally, and I was, I worked my way through, the ranks. And, I felt that, there was a lot of trust and confidence and, you really build a team. But, when the opportunity with Northwell came along, I would say that, firstly, it just sparked curiosity and, it really ended up, being a lot of conversations around, the future of Northwell. And, I would say that my perspective also evolved with those conversations. And, it was really about stepping into a new kind of challenge and, very different environment. And I would say with a distinct strategy and I would say vision and amazing culture. The decision, was really around, I would say, growth. And, that has meant that I've had to reset myself and really push myself, sometimes be beyond my comfort zone, and embrace the unknown. And, but I would say that, the leadership team at Northwell has really been amazing. And, they have really, I would say, embraced me. They have, I've learned so much, quite frankly, in the last 2.5 years, and feel that I've, been able to contribute in a really meaningful way.
It's a big
The
deal.
chief digital officer role at Northwell. Yeah, it is a big deal. I definitely think it was the right decision. And, each day I'm just so energized about the work that we're doing on digital transformation. And there's just such a commitment to technology as a differentiator. And, it's just been an exciting time. And, I think that it has reaffirmed to me, that growth comes in moments where you're willing to start again, start fresh.
Mhm. That's right. Well, there's a lot of risk in that type of decision, especially like you said, you've been at Mount Sinai for 20 years. How in the world do you balance new opportunity growth with an absolute fear, right? Because so many risk averse people might say, I'm comfortable, I'll keep riding this out for another however many years until I retire, and I'm just going to stay where I am because I'm afraid. They may not admit it, but I'm afraid to move into this other thing. Did you deal with that fear, and how did you overcome it and say the risk is worth the growth?
Yeah, I think what's really important when anyone is looking for an opportunity is to make sure that you understand the culture of the organization that you're going to and
Yeah.
whether you're going to be a match or the culture is a match for you. And, I hear, many stories of people who have left their organizations and moved to, another organization. And, while the job was going to be interesting and fulfilling, there wasn't a cultural match. So, and that to me is one of the most important prerequisites. So, when I had met the leadership team, for me, it was about, making sure that, there was a cultural match on both sides, apart from the work that was truly compelling. And, as I started to feel that, really the culture really is outstanding at Northwell, I think that allayed, any concerns that I had.
I like that. Okay, I have a culture question for you because this is always a really interesting topic that I deal with when people are going to interviews for, these impressive roles, but want to make sure that that culture is right. So I want you to kind of wear two hats for me and think one, when you made the transition to Northwell, was it just that interaction with the other leadership team members that gave you the confidence of a culture fit? And then from the other side of things, when you are hiring as a chief digital officer and someone wants to know about culture, what are some of the things that you hear that they ask you that you go, okay, they're looking for cultural alignment, and you like that they're looking for cultural alignment?
Yeah, I think that, it's not only your individual experience that you're having in the interviews around culture. I think it's important to speak to, previous employees, and, or people that you already know in your network. So, I was able to speak to, people who had, joined other organizations from Northwell that I knew already in my network and ask them about the culture and, what was, great about it. And, I think that, when I flip it around and think about, interviewing, I'm actually asking a lot of questions to ensure that there is a cultural match. And look, I would say a good example would be, at Northwell we really like spending time together in person, and as a team, as a leadership team within my department, and if you're a team member who doesn't really want to, embrace, either in person or, spending time with their team members, I think that, there's going to be a lack of cultural alignment.
Yeah. And that can hurt in the long term, right? Because if you find yourself somewhere where there's no cultural alignment, the digging yourself out of that can be years in the making sometimes. At this level especially, right? Like how many open chief digital officers are there out there, right? There's not a ton open. You can't just jump ship and land another job very, very quickly in this. So I like that you're specific about that. And I like that from the hiring side that you're being specific about finding that out for yourself too, right? It's not just the candidate's responsibility to determine if it's the right fit, it's also the organization's responsibility.
Absolutely.
That's great. All right, so as you think back over your career, we've talked about some like intentional resets, some big defining moments like your big move. At what point were you looking at yourself as a real leader? And I always like to kind of get a sense for like how you developed your own leadership style. Was it just natural as you progressed in your career and rose in level? Were you thinking about it really intentionally? How did that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that back in 2004, when I joined, Mount Sinai as a director, one of the first areas that I was focused on was a system selection for electronic health record, and ultimately we chose Epic. Now, once we chose Epic, it was then having to start building a team. So going through and actually, thinking about what are the roles that I need as part of my team. It was building a department. And so being part of those interview processes, and really making sure that you're building a department that is going to run this program, that was really starting from inception. So I would say that at that point, when I started building a team, that was, my first foray into leadership. I had a great colleague that I worked with who actually, spoke to me about, when you join an organization or you start a new leadership role, or it's your first time leadership role, it's really important to be open to coaching. And in fact, I actually engaged a coach, and that was my first, I would say, coaching experience that I found tremendously helpful, because I think that all of us in leadership have had rookie errors, right? And things that is part of leadership that you're learning, but could have avoided. And I think that having a coach and someone that you can speak to about these things and is helping you on your leadership development journey is incredibly important. I know
Yes, I
that
love that you
some
said
people,
that.
yeah, I know that some people don't feel, maybe are not open to coaching. But, I think that, throughout my career, at different phases of my career, I definitely have had coaching, and I see it as an investment that either you're making in yourself or the organization is making in you, and just incredibly helpful.
Absolutely. I mean, my leadership extends literally to just my business, and I still engage in coaching. So, for me, it's about finding what's kind of locked inside of you and unlocking that potential. And like you said, thinking from other perspectives, having somebody walk with you through that to open those things up is so important. I mean, I invest in a mastermind group that I have specifically for entrepreneurs. And that has been one of the greatest investments I've made because it's kind of finally all about me, right? In our organizations and our companies, we're giving and giving and giving and leading and doing all these things. That coaching aspect is kind of giving back to yourself, which is so special.
Yes.
I love that. All right, so I want to end with a question, and I want you to kind of go back in time and imagine yourself back in Australia in college what kind of advice would you give to your past self that would either make your journey better or stronger or more enjoyable for you? What would you say to young Kristen about a professional career?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say sometimes you've got to slow down to go faster. And I think that earlier on in your career, sometimes and it sounds counterintuitive, but you feel like you've got to move fast and there's a lot of speed and momentum. But I think that pushing ahead without, clarity can create, rework and potential misunderstandings and misalignment. And I think sometimes you've got to step back and really, align on priorities and make an assessment. And, ultimately, it can actually accelerate the progress that you make. I would definitely give that advice. I don't know whether I would have been willing to necessarily hear it or absorb it, but that would be one thing. Secondly, it probably not at college, but earlier on in my career, I probably would have, just really make sure around, utilizing consultants. I think that, they bring a lot of expertise, but for very specific engagements. But the bottom line is that, you have to, and your organization have to always own the result, and the work has to be grounded in the organization's context. So I think that's really important. I do think, and we talked about this a little bit more, culture, right? And it's not ever a one and done. It's really continuous, and it has to be with intention. And it's every little interaction that you make, as a leader, is incredibly important. And just making sure that there's town halls and communications and recognition programs give a strong foundation. But to me, that's a starting point. So but I do think that culture is something that everyone really needs to probably focus on.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. As you were saying that, I kept, kind of putting things in this box of this is you're basically telling yourself, your younger self, to project manage your own career, right? You start with the clarity piece. What are the priorities? What do we need to accomplish here? Slow down and think about it first. Then use your right resources, right? That's the, rely on consultants, but take ownership, right? Like you can look for those external resources to support you in your growth. And then the culture piece is making sure you've got the right people in the right seats with the right attitudes doing the right thing. It's like a very solutions or systems architect approach to your career management. I like that.
Excellent.
That's really cool. Well, I am so grateful that you shared with everyone today, because hearing from folks like you who are so intentional and have such a passion and have pursued that passion in such a meaningful way, and the impact that you're having on such a huge health system, so many patients, so many employees, it's inspiring to see, and I'm so grateful you shared today.
Thank you, Mark, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks for spending time with me in the boardroom. If today's conversation sparks something for you and you want clarity on what comes next, visit theboardroom.net to book a reset session or to learn about upcoming leadership retreats. Your next move does not have to wait. I'll see you next episode.